Professor Andrew Natsios, Executive Professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and Dr. Katerina Shinkaruk, Senior Lecturer at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, for a discussion on weaponizing wheat, Russia, Ukraine, and global food security, moderated by FP's Executive Vice President, Allison Carlson.
Hello, everyone. Hello again. Thank you to those in the room, and thanks to those who are joining us online around the world. As you've been hearing and seeing today, there have been so many discussions about the innovations that are really contributing to greater food security around the world and resilience. And, this conversation is also going to be focused on what happens when those systems are destabilized and experiencing extreme shocks, and what can be done to make those systems more resilient. The title of this session is called Weaponizing Wheat, and we're focusing in on this conversation about the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the withdrawal of Russia a few months ago, and the cascading impacts that's had for Ukraine, as well as other countries around the world. And we have two experts with us today who I'm really excited to speak to about this, not only about what the impacts are in the immediate term, but what are some of the cascading risks to global food security and markets around the world, and also what are some of the near-term and longer-term investments that can be made to ensure that there's greater diversity of supply, value chains, and those sorts of things to invest in the resilience of the system. So when we're talking about Ukraine and the agricultural sector, this constitutes about 20% of the country's GDP and 40% of export revenue, and I believe about a fifth of the workforce. And so attacking the agricultural system effectively and weaponizing food is having a tremendous impact and has become a weapon of war. And so, Katerina, I'd like to turn to you first. Having been from and coming from Ukraine, how are you seeing this impact the country, the war-fighting effort in real time?
Yeah, thank you, Allison. I will say that this disruption of the grain initiative has had obviously effects on Ukraine's economy, Ukraine's war-fighting effort, but also on geopolitical context more broadly, which brings me to the point that Russia benefits from the disruption of this initiative geopolitically and militarily. And I will say that on economic side, you mentioned 40% of foreign currency revenues. Well, that number increased from 2022 to 2023 to 60%. So currently, and 30% of Ukraine's arable lands are mined. So this has been obviously hitting hard Ukraine's economy, Ukraine's labor force, Ukraine's GDP, and as a result, it has effects on its war-fighting capability in terms of defense investments, in terms of including morale of the civilians and the military. Obviously, one of the goals in terms of war fighting that Russia pursues here is destroying infrastructure and destroying economy if it doesn't succeed militarily on the front line. So this is like the second front. And in geopolitical terms, I would say that this has obviously global dimensions for food security, but it creates avenues to exploit in relations with the countries of the global south, basically removing Ukraine from the market and increasing Russia's leverage and basically potential for building its soft power in the region. While in the Central Europe, it actually helps Russia exploit the divisions which have been, bringing attention to the headlines here and in Europe about 5 neighboring countries banning Ukraine's exports. And basically now it it all comes up to Ukraine even filing cases to the World Trade Organization. And we can see some, very bitter fallouts with Poland. And obviously, all this plays into the broader goal of undermining unity in the European Union for Ukraine and supporting Ukraine more broadly, not just in terms of food security.
Absolutely. And, I think that's a dynamic that isn't as discussed, are the dynamics in the region. Certainly, the exports and the impact on prices for those importing nations in the global south, which you mentioned, have been more reported in the media and those sorts of things. But how this effort is destabilizing the geopolitical dynamics in the region are something that isn't as often discussed. So I appreciate you raising that here. And Andrew, I'd like to turn to you. And from your perspective, you've mentioned that we've neglected agriculture for far too long, and the repercussions that has, not only in terms of food security, but geopolitical security. And I'm wondering if, reflecting on Katerina's comments, how are you looking at this crisis in terms of that destabilization, and what can be done in the immediate term to mitigate it?
I started my career 30 years ago in international development, more on the emergency side, when I ran the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance when President Bush 41 was in office. That's the office in AID that responds to civil wars, famines, and natural disasters. And I saw the result of disruption of the agricultural systems during civil wars, where the young men are taken into the militias and they live off the land. They do enormous damage. So I saw how important it was. We tried to increase agriculture. We did, but all of it went to Afghanistan and Iraq. I wanted to actually spend a lot more money in Africa. AID had a huge agriculture program in the 50s, 60s, or in the 60s when AID was formed, but we had an aid program in the 50s. 50% of AID's budget in the 60s and 70s was spent on the Green Revolution of Dr. Norman Borlaug's. So we were the principal mechanism. He told me once before he died that AID was the principal mechanism for actually operationalizing this stuff on the field. That has all massively declined since the 80s. And we attempted to increase it, and there were resistance from different groups. Who did increase it was President Obama, and we were different parties, but I was a strong supporter of the Feed the Future initiative, which continues in place, and it was a bipartisan effort actually in the Congress to, it's $1 billion more for agricultural development. One of the other things that I've done that I think I had a very small part in it, but in the late 60s, to institutionalize the Green Revolution, they created the Western donors, principally the CGIAR, the Consultative Group in International Agricultural Research, which are, it used to be 17 or 18 research stations. It's now 14 because civil wars have shut down some of them. They employ tens of thousands of agricultural scientists and economists. And they have a banana institute in Nigeria, sorghum and millet in Zimbabwe, potatoes in Peru, corn and maize in Mexico, rice in the Philippines. And they develop publicly held patents on, not patents, but rights to improve genetics. Not GMO, that's too controversial, though personally I'm a supporter of GMO, and I think it's terrible. It's been politicized, to be very frank with you. We need GMO technology to improve agricultural production, not just in the private sector. We need it in the public sector. And the CGIAR doesn't do it because it's too controversial. But I chaired a committee for 5 years in the CG system called Harvest Plus, which breeds micronutrients into poor people's diet, because there are three major, according to the World Health Organization, three major micronutrient deficiencies: vitamin A, zinc, and iron. And they have very severe health outcomes. They affect IQ, for example, in children. Women's mortality rates increase because of anemia, because of a lack of iron. And we now know from the research done on global warming that warming will reduce micronutrients in traditional crops. So unless we do something to breed the micronutrients back in, nutrition is actually going to deteriorate. So we've bred 300 crops now, but we have to get them out to 1 billion people, and that's an interesting thing we're doing. So there is a technology answer to some of this. The other thing is the amount of water available is dramatically dropping, as you may know, for a variety of reasons, but we're going to have water wars at some point. And so there are new irrigation technologies. They're not that new, but Israel developed some of it with drip technology. So that's another issue. But in terms of the current crisis, one of the things I learned in disaster management is human systems can take one shock. Then the second shock comes, you destabilize. 3 or 4 shocks, the system collapses. So we now have 4 major shocks going on to the world food system, which feeds the world. Most of it is private. 95% of the world food system is private, and it hasn't been studied that much. Only 5% or 6% of it is public. We think of the World Food Program and USAID food and the European Union, the Japanese, the Canadians, and Australia. But the reality is that that's a very small percentage to feed the world. So the first shock is that we have a huge refugee crisis, and this predates the war in Ukraine. That made it much worse. So we have 80 million people, the most since World War II, who are displaced, or it's forced migration, either internally displaced or refugees. Some can support themselves by finding jobs. Most have to be fed or they will die. And that is putting severe stress on the international aid system.
Indeed. If I could jump in for
Yes.
1 second. Certainly, these issues are multifaceted and complex and
Right.
absolutely far-reaching. And I'd like to turn back to the near-term interventions that can potentially be made now to address the destabilization in the context of Ukraine. And so, Katerina, if I could turn back to you, understanding the issues are certainly complex, but are there any near-term interventions that come to mind for you that are practical, realistic, and actually feasible in light of the context that exists right now in and around Ukraine?
Yes, this is a very good question. Obviously, the UN is a great place to discuss those interventions. As I mentioned previously, the Global South actors play a big role, and it is important to bring them on board. And this is also a way, to actually think of how the soft power campaigns are being waged in the South, in the Global South countries. It's like one of the angle of bringing them on board. It's important because, in 2023, Russia's soft power global index rank was, just dropped by 3 positions from 9 to 13. And we have, 2/3 of global population supporting Russia. So basically, supporting, being neutral or leaning. But my point here is that it is very important to win the public opinion in the Global South and to bring them on board here at the UN. In terms of practical interventions, this could also bring us to the conversation about UN reform and making UN more efficient. And this is an existential conversation for this institution, I believe. When it comes to local, regional security and the intervention that could be made locally, of course, it is very important to keep providing Ukraine's security, air defense security, because the current alternative route for grain exports in Ukraine are river ports in Danube, which are being heavily shelled specifically by the Iranian drones. So air defense for those ports. And on the broader scale, the more deterioration Ukraine experiences with this war, the more effect it produces on its ability to actually be a contributor to food security, the more dire effects we will see in the medium term. So again, it all boils down to helping Ukraine, survive as a state, and to local security issues, including in the Black Sea, per se, as we can see that some recent successes were achieved by Ukraine's military, specifically in the Black Sea, and of course this support from the Western partners is critical here as well.
Absolutely. And so, in the context of this week, if you were to see a few actions taken and outcomes, what would they be? If you could pinpoint, what would be a win for you in the context of this crisis?
Well, I would definitely see as a win finding some constructive ways to discuss the tensions currently existing between Ukraine and its Central European neighbors, because this plays against, the overall calculus for the Western support, and Russia is applauding to that. And I would definitely see as a success some progress made on tangible measures taken in terms of, or agreements made in terms of reforming UN. Specifically, there are some conversations about potentially introducing the rules that would allow to overcome a veto with 2/3 of the votes of the member states. That's one of the potential avenues to make UN actually a more efficient player here. And definitely, I wouldn't find helpful any, discussions about resuming grain initiative on Russia's conditions and providing it with the leverage to blackmail international community, but rather actually bringing it back to the international law framework.
Great, that's pointed and constructive, and it's a good point of what could work and just what will not be helpful at this stage from your perspective. So thank you for surfacing that. And I think this issue is so acute and it's so pointed and really underscores the importance of supply chain resilience and the investments that need to be made to ensure that for food systems around the world. And, when you think of, Andrew, over to you, when you think of the critical choke points that exist, I think this issue is very instructive for how we think about vulnerabilities in our global food system. And in light of that, what are some of the concrete and pointed investments and priorities from your perspective that need to be made? I know earlier you were talking about some longer term and complex issues, but how should we be thinking about protecting those choke points and diversifying our supply?
Well, right now there are 14, 15 choke points on the high seas that affect the world food system, and they do because something like 70% of the calories we all consume are at some point or another on the ocean, and because it is a world food system, privately maintained. Right now, there are 200-300 ships waiting to go through the Panama Canal, and they can't go through because there's not enough water in the locks to get through. And as a consequence, a lot of that is food from Texas. There are animals actually in some of those ships from Texas, cattle going to Asia. And going all the way around the tip of Latin America, South America, does not work in the case of some of the ships. So I'm not sure how to fix that from an engineering point of view. Part of that is El Nino. So if you take global warming, you put on top of it, you layer El Nino. That is why we're seeing these very odd weather anomalies. In California, they call it a river of water from the sky, flooding large parts of Northern California. That is El Nino, because what happens typically with El Nino is it reverses if you're a drought-prone area, it makes it very wet. If you're a wet area, it makes it eliminates the water or rainfall. And so typically we see huge disruptions in the agricultural system. And we're seeing that right now. It started earlier this year. Some say it'll end the end of this year. Some people predict it won't be to the end of next year. Let's hope it ends this year, because it's disastrous in terms of rice production, for example, in Asia. Xi Jinping apparently is obsessed now with the food supply of China because of this. I don't have an engineering solution to the Panama Canal, and we can't affect the immediate impact of how long El Nino lasts, but it's having an effect. We can deal with the problem of this mass displacement. It's caused by political upheavals. There is no government in Khartoum right now, effectively, because there's a civil war going on between one of the elements of the government that used to be the Janjaweed militia that has been indicted for genocide before the world bodies in The Hague and they can't prosecute anyone because no one's been arrested. But the fact that there's no government, 1 million people have left Egypt already, for Egypt and other countries, and so this displacement has political roots. 8 African countries have had coups in the last year and a half, and one of the analyses I've seen is they're all driven by rapid increases in food prices. We know food affects political stability. The so-called Arab Spring, no one calls it a spring anymore, and 6 countries in the Middle East were all driven by massive food price increases. I tried pointing that out in Washington. People said, no, it's oppressive governments, it's corruption. I said, no, it's not. It's food price increases. That's what causes people to displace their government on the streets.
I think your points are really well taken, and I think what's been underscored here is there are concrete actions and steps that need to be taken to address the current crisis in the moment, but also these complex, intersectional, and multifaceted issues need to be thought through, planned for greater preparedness going forward, because agricultural systems are so vital to lives, livelihoods, and ultimately our security. So I appreciate both of your perspectives and sharing your experience with us, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.